Deep within the Gothic streets of central Yharnam, past the mob of torch-wielding huntsmen and through the labyrinthine sewers where creatures lurk in shadow, there stands a graveyard. The Tomb of Uden, they call it, though no tomb exists there. Only tombstones scattered across uneven ground and the lingering stench of death that permeates everything in this cursed city. Here, among the graves and beneath a sky that hangs heavy with an oppressive darkness, a hunter prowls. Not just any hunter, but one whose story encapsulates everything that Bloodborne represents. His name is Father Gascoigne, and his tale is one of devotion, family, bloodlust, and an inevitable descent into the very thing he swore to destroy. For many who venture into Yharnam, Father Gascoigne represents their first true test. The cleric beast may have introduced them to the game's brutality, but it's an optional encounter, a gatekeeper that can be bypassed. Gascoigne cannot. He stands as the mandatory guardian between central Yharnam and the cathedral ward, between the player's tentative first steps and their deeper journey into nightmare. But he is so much more than a mechanical skill check or a boss designed to punish the unprepared. Father Gascoigne is a mirror held up to every hunter who walks the streets of Yharnam. He is proof that no one, no matter how skilled or devoted, remains immune to the blood's call. The man who would become this cautionary tale didn't start his journey in Yharnam. Like the player character themselves, Gascoigne came from foreign shores, drawn to the city by tales of miraculous blood ministration, and perhaps seeking something he couldn't find in his homeland. The title that precedes his name offers our first clue to his origins. Father isn't a rank recognized by the Healing Church of Yharnam. It's a foreign designation, one given to clerics in distant lands where religious structures differ from those in this Gothic nightmare of a city. The very fact that he retained this title even after arriving in Yharnam speaks to something fundamental about his character. Perhaps it was pride in his origins, or maybe a desperate attempt to hold on to the man he once was, a tether to his former life before the blood and the hunt consumed everything. The journey to Yharnam. The reasons Gascoigne left his homeland remain unspecified in the game itself. Given what we know of Yharnam's reputation, he may have been drawn like countless other pilgrims by tales of the Healing Church's miraculous blood ministration. Whether he sought healing for himself or others, or perhaps came to understand this phenomenon from a theological perspective, we can only infer from his established identity as a foreign cleric. The Victorian Gothic setting of Yharnam, with its clear inspirations drawn from cities like London, suggests that Gascoigne's journey would have been no simple undertaking. This was an era where travel between nations required significant resources and determination. What we do know is that Gascoigne arrived bearing the mantle of a holy man, someone who had earned respect and authority in whatever foreign church had ordained him. The description of his garb makes it clear that the title Father held no meaning within the Healing Church's hierarchy, yet he retained it nonetheless. The significance of this is open to interpretation. It could suggest a determination to maintain his original identity, or perhaps the Church simply allowed foreign clerics to keep their titles as a way to demonstrate their cosmopolitan reach. Upon his arrival in Yharnam, Gascoigne would have witnessed a city unlike any other. The Healing Church had risen to prominence through its distribution of the Old Blood, a miraculous substance discovered in ancient labyrinths beneath the city. These labyrinths, remnants of the ancient Pythagorean civilization, held secrets that scholars from Bjergenwerth had begun to uncover. Master Willem and his students, including a man named Lawrence, had ventured into these depths and found something extraordinary: blood that possessed seemingly supernatural properties. This blood could cure any affliction, heal grievous wounds, and even enhance physical capabilities beyond normal human limits. The process of administering this blood became known as blood ministration, and it transformed Yharnam from an ordinary city into a pilgrimage destination. People flooded in from across the continent, desperate for healing, seeking miracles that conventional medicine couldn't provide. The sick, the dying, the afflicted, all made the journey to Yharnam, drawn by tales of impossible cures and miraculous recoveries. Blood ministration itself was a carefully controlled process, at least in its early days. The healing church didn't simply hand out blood vials to anyone who asked. The process involved rituals, procedures, careful measurement, and administration. Blood ministers, specialized doctors who served the church, would evaluate patients, determine appropriate dosages, and oversee the transfusions. These ministers wore distinctive white garb that marked their status within the church hierarchy, and they carried themselves with the authority of those who held power over life and death. The blood they administered came from various sources, though the church guarded the specifics of their supply chain jealously. Some blood was harvested from the ancient Thumerian labyrinths beneath the city, drawn from sources deep underground, where the old blood pooled in reservoirs that had existed for millennia. Other blood came from specific Great Ones, incomprehensible cosmic entities whose very existence defied normal understanding. The church maintained communion with at least one of these beings, a creature called Ebrietas, who dwelled in the upper cathedral ward, and her blood became a particularly prized substance for the church's purposes. But regardless of its source, the old blood worked. That was the terrible truth at the heart of everything. It actually delivered on the promises the church made. Terminal illnesses vanished overnight. Wounds that should have been fatal closed within hours. Chronic conditions that had plagued people their entire lives simply disappeared after a single treatment. The miracles were real, which made it almost impossible to question the methods or worry about potential consequences. The city had become a beacon of hope, its grand cathedral spires reaching toward the heavens, its streets filled with the faithful who believed they had found salvation. The healing church's influence grew with each successful treatment, with each person who walked away cured of ailments that should have killed them. Blood ministration became more than just medicine. It became a religious sacrament, a communion with something greater than human understanding. But beneath this veneer of holy purpose, something darker festered. The very blood that healed also corrupted. Those who partook of blood ministration found themselves changed, not just physically healed, but fundamentally altered. The old blood carried with it an intoxication more powerful than any wine, a euphoria that made it impossible to resist taking more. Citizens began to crave it, seeking blood ministration not out of medical necessity but from addiction. The line between treatment and recreational use blurred until it effectively disappeared. And with each dose, with each blood vial consumed, the risk of transformation grew. The beast lurked within everyone who tasted the blood, a corruption that worked its way through flesh and bone and mind. It didn't happen immediately. The transformation could take months or years. But it was always there, waiting. The moment when flesh would twist and reason would flee, leaving only savage hunger behind, wasn't a question of if, but when. Joining the hunt Father Gascoigne didn't come to Yharnam to become a hunter. At least, that seems unlikely given what we know of his character as a foreign cleric. But in Yharnam, circumstances have a way of reshaping people's destinies. The scourge of the beast had become an inescapable reality of life in the city, a plague that no amount of prayer or medicine could cure because it was fundamentally tied to the very treatment that the healing church provided. Every night, as darkness fell and the blood moon rose in the sky, those who had succumbed to the blood's corruption would transform. Their humanity would be stripped away as they became slavering monsters driven by an insatiable hunger for flesh. The transformation wasn't always complete or permanent in the early stages. Some unfortunates would shift between human and beast forms, trapped in a nightmare of fluctuating identity. But eventually, given enough time and enough corruption, the beast would win permanently. The streets that seemed almost noble in daylight became hunting grounds when the moon rose, ordinary citizens learned to barricade themselves behind doors and windows, nailing boards across entries, blocking out the sounds of violence from outside. Red lanterns marked homes where people still lived, still hoped, still prayed that the morning would come and the night would release its grip. But every night brought new horrors, new disappearances, new empty homes that would never see their occupants return. The healing church, recognizing that their miracle cure came with a terrible cost, had established the hunters as their answer to the beast plague. This wasn't an admission of failure, not publicly. The official story was that the beasts came from outside, from those who misused the blood or who were too weak to handle its power properly. The church presented themselves as protectors, and the hunters as their holy warriors, skilled fighters equipped with specialized weapons designed specifically to combat the transformed. The hunters were meant to be protectors, guardians who would keep the citizens safe from the monsters that prowled the night. In practice, they became something far more complex, walking the razor's edge between humanity and beasthood themselves. Every hunter relied on blood vials to survive their encounters with beasts, consuming the very substance that caused the transformations in the first place. They told themselves it was different, that they were strong enough to resist, that their purpose would protect them. But the evidence of countless fallen hunters suggested otherwise. Gascoigne joined these ranks, taking up the hunter axe and a modified pistol that functioned like a blunderbuss. The decision to become a hunter couldn't have been made lightly. Based on what we know of his character, a foreign cleric who maintained his title even in a land where it held no official meaning, this seems like someone with a strong sense of duty and purpose. He may have seen joining the hunt as an extension of his clerical responsibilities, a way to protect the flock from very literal wolves. A shepherd doesn't abandon his sheep when predators circle, after all. Maybe he believed that by joining the hunt, he could help find a solution to the Scourge, study it from within, and discover some way to break the curse that had settled over Yharnam like a funeral shroud. His religious background might have led him to seek spiritual answers where others saw only physical threats. Or perhaps, like so many others, he simply found himself with no other choice. In a city where beasts roamed freely each night, everyone had to make a decision about how they would survive. Fight, hide, or die, those were the options, and Gascoigne chose to fight. The hunter's garb he adopted tells its own story through the details embedded in its description. Similar to the workshop's standard hunter attire, Gascoigne's clothing bore the marks of his service to the healing church. A dingy scarf, specifically described as a holy shawl and symbol of the healing church, marked him as affiliated with the church during his hunting days. This wasn't just decorative. It was a sign of authority, proof that he hunted with the church's blessing and support. But there's a crucial detail in the garb's description. Gascoigne would eventually part ways from the church. This separation suggests a falling out or a departure that happened at some point during his time as a hunter. The game doesn't specify why this happened, leaving us to wonder what might have driven a wedge between the foreign cleric and the institution he served. Did he discover something about the church's practices that troubled his conscience? Did the church cast him out for some transgression? Or was it a mutual parting of ways, perhaps driven by his growing family responsibilities or his declining mental state? Whatever the cause, this separation didn't stop him from hunting. The fact that he's found at the tomb of Odin, actively hunting and killing, proves that his work continued even after his formal ties to the church were severed. This could suggest that hunting had become more than just a job for him. It had become an obsession, a compulsion he couldn't escape, even when institutional support was withdrawn. The description of his garments offers another chilling detail that foreshadows his ultimate fate. His clothing was tainted by a pungent, beastly stench, one that the text says, eats away at Gascoigne. This phrasing is notable because it's active rather than passive. It's not just that his clothes smell like beast blood from all the creatures he's killed. The stench is described as doing something to him, consuming him in some way. This could be interpreted multiple ways. On one level, it might be evidence of how long he'd been hunting, how many beasts he'd slaughtered, how thoroughly their blood had soaked into his garments and by extension into his skin, his lungs, his very being. Every hunter who fights beasts long enough would accumulate this smell, badge of their profession and proof of their experience. But the description suggests something more sinister might be at work. The beast scourge in Bloodborne isn't just transmitted through blood ministration. It's enhanced and accelerated by exposure to beast blood, by violence, by the act of hunting itself. Each time Gascoigne killed a beast, he was exposed to corrupted blood. Each time he was wounded by claws or fangs, that corruption had a chance to enter his system. The pungent, beastly stench might represent not just the smell of his victims, but the gradual infiltration of their essence into his own body, the beast working its way into him from the outside in, while the old blood in his system worked from the inside out. The partnership with Henryk, In his early days as a hunter, Father Gascoigne was paired with another warrior, a man known simply as Henryk. The contrast between the two must have been striking. Where Gascoigne seemed driven by purpose and conviction, carrying himself with the authority of his clerical background, Henryk presented as taciturn, a quiet, almost silent presence who let his actions speak louder than words. The description calls him taciturn, a word that suggests not just silence but a deliberate withholding of speech, someone who has perhaps seen too much to waste words on the obvious. The old hunter wore distinctive yellow garb that offered exceptional protection against bolt damage, garments that marked him as a veteran of specific types of encounters. In Yharnam, different types of beasts and creatures posed different threats, and experienced hunters learned to gear themselves accordingly. Henryk's choice of bolt-resistant equipment suggests he'd fought enough dark beasts, terrifying electricity-wreathed creatures, to know that specialized protection was necessary for survival. This wasn't the equipment of a novice or someone who hunted casually. This was the armor of someone who'd learned through hard experience what it took to survive. Henryk had been doing this work longer than most. The game's descriptions refer to him specifically as an old hunter, a designation that carries weight in Yharnam. Old hunters were those who'd survived from the earlier days of the hunt, back when the practices and traditions were still being established. They'd witnessed the evolution of hunting techniques, seen countless weapons and strategies tested, watched generations of hunters come and go. The fact that Henryk had survived long enough to earn this designation was itself remarkable. His very survival was notable, described in his equipment as tragically long, in a way that suggested living through so many hunts was a burden rather than a blessing. This phrasing is crucial to understanding Henryk's character. In most contexts, a long life would be seen as a gift, something to celebrate. But for a hunter in Yharnam, longevity came with a terrible cost. It meant you'd outlived your comrades. It meant you'd watched friends transform into beasts and had to put them down. It meant carrying the weight of all those deaths, all those failures, all those moments when you couldn't save someone. The tragic nature of his long life suggests Henryk had survived more than he wished he had seen things he wished he could forget, had done things that haunted him in whatever quiet moments hunters were allowed. Every hunt survived was another mark on a tally that kept growing, another memory added to a collection that was probably becoming unbearable. Based on the equipment descriptions and his title as an old hunter, Henryk had been active since the earlier days of the Healing Church's expansion, which means he'd witnessed the beast scourge grow from a manageable problem to an overwhelming catastrophe. Together, these two formed what was described as a fierce and gallant duo. Fierce speaks to their combat effectiveness. They were formidable fighters who could handle threats that would overwhelm lesser hunters. Gallant suggests something more, though, a nobility or honor in how they conducted themselves. They weren't just efficient killers but warriors who maintained some code of conduct, some standard of behavior that elevated them above simple thugs or butchers. Gascoigne brought intensity and perhaps a certain moral conviction to their partnership, the fire of someone who believed he was fighting for a righteous cause. Henryk's experience and tactical approach complemented this perfectly. Where Gascoigne might have charged forward with passionate aggression, Henryk likely provided the cool-headed calculation that kept them both alive. Their fighting styles probably meshed well, Gascoigne with his axe favoring direct confrontation and overwhelming force, while Henryk used his saw cleaver and throwing knives to control distance and create openings. They hunted through the streets of Yharnam side by side, night after night, facing down horrors that would have sent ordinary men fleeing in terror. The beasts they fought weren't mindless animals, but corrupted humans, people who might have been neighbors or friends or family members before the transformation took hold. Every beast put down was a small tragedy, a life lost to the Scourge, another failure of the blood ministration that was supposed to save people. And these two men bore witness to that tragedy on a nightly basis, adding to the weight they both carried. The description of their partnership as having led to Henryk's tragically long life carries weight when you consider what it means to be a hunter in Yharnam. Most hunters don't last long. Either the beasts claim them, tearing them apart in some dark alley or abandoned building, or the blood claims them from within, transforming them into the very monsters they once fought. To survive as long as Henryk had, to continue hunting while maintaining your humanity, that required something extraordinary. But it also meant witnessing the fall of countless other hunters, watching friends and comrades succumb one by one to bloodlust and transformation. Perhaps Henryk's taciturn nature stemmed from having seen too much, spoken too many names of the fallen, mourned too many losses. Their partnership was effective enough that both men earned reputations within Yharnam's hunting community. They became known quantities, reliable hunters who could be counted on when the beast grew particularly bold or when some especially dangerous creature needed to be put down. But effectiveness in hunting came at a cost. The more they fought, the more blood they were exposed to, the deeper they waded into the Scourge. Every beast slain meant more corrupted blood splattered across their weapons and clothing, seeping through fabric to touch skin, working its way into their systems through countless small wounds and abrasions. The healing church encouraged the use of blood vials among hunters. These vials contained blood that could heal injuries instantaneously, allowing hunters to survive encounters that would have killed ordinary humans. But each vial consumed added more old blood to the hunter's system, strengthening the beast within even as it healed the body. It was a devil's bargain, one that every hunter accepted because the alternative was death. Gascoigne and Henryk would have used countless blood vials over their time hunting together, each one bringing them incrementally closer to the edge of transformation. A family in Yharnam. But Father Gascoigne's life wasn't defined solely by the hunt. Somewhere along his journey, perhaps in the early days after his arrival in Yharnam, or perhaps later after he'd already taken up the hunter's profession, he met a woman named Viola. She was Yharnamite through and through, someone who knew the city's streets and customs, who had likely grown up with the healing church's influence shaping every aspect of her existence. The game doesn't tell us how they met, but we can imagine the circumstances. Perhaps she tended to him after a particularly brutal hunt, cleaning wounds and offering comfort when he needed it most. Or maybe their paths crossed in one of Yharnam's quieter moments, when the city almost seemed normal and the horror of the nightly hunts felt like a distant nightmare rather than constant reality. They fell in love. Against all logic, in a city where death lurked around every corner and the threat of transformation hung over everyone like a sword, suspended by fraying thread, they chose to build a life together. This decision speaks to a remarkable kind of hope or defiance. Yharnam was a city where most people lived in fear, where trust had eroded to almost nothing, where love itself seemed like a dangerous luxury. Yet Gascoigne and Viola chose it anyway, chose each other, chose to believe that something good could exist in the midst of all the corruption and death. Viola became his wife, and together they started a family, bringing 2 daughters into a world that seemed determined to consume everything pure and innocent. The decision to have children in Yharnam carries profound implications. These weren't abstract considerations for Gascoigne and Viola. Every time Gascoigne left for the hunt, Viola had to face the possibility that he wouldn't return. Every night, she had to wonder if this would be the night he transformed, if the beast would finally win its war for his soul. And every night, she had to look at her daughters and wonder what kind of future they could possibly have in a city like this. The daughters grew up in an environment that most children never have to endure. They learned early what it meant to have a father who was a hunter, understanding that each night when he left their home might be the night he didn't return. They would have heard the sounds outside during the hunts, the screams, the violence, the sounds of beasts and hunters clashing in the darkness. They learned to recognize the difference between the sounds of hunting and the sounds of something having gone wrong. They learned to fear certain hours of the night more than others, to listen for footsteps that might signal father's return, or might signal something much worse. The family lived in central Yharnam, in a modest home that would have offered some protection from the nightly horrors, but couldn't insulate them from the reality of their situation. The house had to be fortified every night, windows barred, doors locked and barred, every possible entry point secured. Inside, Viola and her daughters would wait, listening to the violence outside, praying that their husband and father would return home safely. The younger daughter in particular seems to have taken on the role of the optimistic one, the child who still believed things would be okay as long as they stayed together, as long as they had hope. Living in a household with a hunter for a father meant living with certain truths that other families might not have faced so directly. The daughters knew what their father did. They knew he killed things that had once been people. They knew he came home covered in blood that wasn't his own. They probably knew, on some level, that the beasts he fought were victims of the same blood ministration that everyone in Yharnam participated in, which meant that anyone could become a beast, maybe even people they knew, maybe even people in their own family. And yet, there was love in that household. The existence of the music box proves it. Someone, likely Viola, went to the effort of obtaining or creating this item specifically as a tool to help Gascoigne. The names inscribed inside, Viola and Gascoigne, suggest it was meant to be a personal thing, a reminder of their bond. The fact that it played a song shared by her mother and father, as the item description states, indicates this was more than just a functional tool. It was a symbol of their relationship, of the connection they maintained even as the hunt threatened to tear it apart. Viola understood her husband in ways perhaps no one else could, not even his hunting partner Henryk. She lived with him, saw him in moments of vulnerability that he wouldn't show to anyone else. She witnessed how the hunt changed him, not just in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts that accumulated over time. The way he'd sometimes stare at nothing for long periods, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. The way his hands would sometimes shake when he was home, the aftermath of adrenaline and violence working its way out of his system. The way he'd grown quieter over the months and years, as if words were becoming harder to form or perhaps just seemed insufficient to describe what he'd experienced. She saw how each night of killing left its mark not just on his body, but on his soul. She watched him come home with fresh wounds, watched him wash blood from his hands and face, watched him try to transition from being a hunter to being a husband and father. That transition became harder over time. Sometimes he'd come through the door and still have that look in his eyes, the one that said he was still out there in his mind, still hunting, still fighting. His daughters would approach him, and he wouldn't immediately recognize them, would need a moment to remember where he was and who these people were. Most troubling of all, Viola witnessed the bloodlust taking hold. This wasn't something that happened overnight, but rather a gradual progression that became impossible to deny. Gascoigne began staying out later, pushing the limits of what was necessary for the hunt. He'd tell her he was eliminating threats, cleaning up beasts before they could endanger civilians, but his absence spoke to something more. He was choosing to be out there, choosing the hunt over home more and more frequently. When he did return, sometimes the bloodlust would still be upon him. His eyes would have a certain gleam, a hunger that had nothing to do with food or exhaustion. He'd be agitated, restless, unable to settle. The slightest provocation might set him off, and though he never raised a hand to his family, not in his human form at least, Viola could see the control it took for him to maintain that restraint. She could see him fighting something inside himself, wrestling with urges and impulses that grew stronger with each passing hunt. The old blood worked its corruption within him, and while Viola might not have understood the full medical or mystical mechanics of it, she understood the result. Her husband was slowly being consumed by the very thing he fought against. The beast wasn't just out there in the streets of Yharnam. It was growing inside Gascoigne, feeding on the violence he participated in, strengthening itself with every blood vial he consumed to heal his wounds. So she developed a strategy, a small lifeline that might pull him back from the edge when the bloodlust grew too strong. She acquired a tiny music box, an innocuous item that played a simple melody. The item's description tells us it was a song shared by her mother and father, though the specific memories attached to it remain unstated. What matters is that this melody meant something to both of them, carried significance that went beyond the mere notes being played. Inside the lid of the music box, inscribed on a small scrap of paper, were two names written faintly: Viola and Gascoigne. This detail is poignant in its simplicity. Just their names, written together, proof of their connection. When opened, when played, the music box became a physical reminder of their relationship, of the bond they shared, of the life they'd built together. The young girl explains that this music box became Viola's tool for bringing him home when the hunt had kept him out too long, playing it to help him remember his family when he began succumbing to bloodlust. The exact mechanics of how she used it aren't detailed, but we can infer the basic pattern from what we're told. On nights when Gascoigne stayed out unusually long, when dawn approached and he still hadn't returned, Viola would venture out. She'd navigate the dangerous streets of central Yharnam, put herself at considerable risk to find her husband and bring him back. When she found him, and the fact that this strategy is described in the past tense suggests it worked multiple times, she'd play the music box. The melody would reach him even through the bloodlust, triggering memories and emotions that were stronger than the compulsion to hunt. He'd remember who he was. He'd remember Viola and their daughters. He'd remember that he had a life beyond the hunt, reasons to come home, people who needed him to remain human. This wasn't magic in any traditional sense, though in a world where insight into eldritch truths can alter perception and where dreams and reality blur together, perhaps the distinction doesn't matter. What matters is that the music box worked. It pulled Gascoigne back from the edge, time and again, proved that love and memory could overcome bloodlust, at least temporarily. On nights when Gascoigne stayed out longer than usual, the young girl tells us that Viola would use the music box to draw him home when he'd been out all night. The exact mechanics of this aren't spelled out explicitly, but the implication is clear. Viola would take the music box and venture out to find her husband, using the melody to remind him of who he was and bring him back to their family. The music served as an anchor to his humanity, pulling him back from the bloodlust that threatened to consume him completely. Their daughters knew about the music box too, understood its importance even if they couldn't fully grasp all the implications of why it was needed. The younger girl especially seems to have latched onto it as a symbol of hope and security. In her dialogue with the player, she speaks of it with complete faith, trusting in its power to bring her mother and father home safely. To her young mind, the music box wasn't just a tool. It was almost magical, a guarantee that as long as they had it, the family would stay together. This childlike faith is heartbreaking in retrospect, knowing how the story ends. The younger daughter believed in the music box's power completely, had probably witnessed its effects before. She'd seen Mother leave with it and return with Father in tow. She'd heard the melody play and watched as recognition would dawn in her father's eyes. Watched as the distant, dangerous look would fade and he'd become her father again, rather than the hunter who wore his face. Those experiences taught her that the music box was special, that it could save them, that as long as they had it, everything would ultimately be okay. The older daughter's perspective remains more ambiguous. The game presents us with two daughters, but the relationship between them and their individual experiences of their father's decline remain largely unexplored. The younger daughter speaks to the player from her window, asking for help finding her mother. The older daughter appears later, after certain story events, and her dialogue and behavior raise questions about her true nature and mental state. But both daughters, whatever their individual circumstances, grew up in a home where father was a hunter, and the music box was a source of comfort and security. They learned to listen for sounds at night, to distinguish between the normal sounds of the hunt and signs that something might be wrong. They learned which hours were most dangerous, when father was most likely to return, when it was safe to peek out windows, and when they should stay hidden. They learned the rituals of preparation, barricading doors, extinguishing lights, making themselves as invisible and quiet as possible. These were skills no children should need to develop, survival techniques that spoke to the nightmarish reality of life in Yharnam, the weight of the hunt. As the years passed, the strain on Gascoigne became increasingly evident. The hunt wasn't something you did for a while and then walked away from. It changed you fundamentally, rewrote who you were on a level that went deeper than flesh and bone. Every night brought new horrors, new beasts to fight, new brushes with death that could only be survived by consuming more blood vials. The temporary relief they provided came with a mounting cost, each vial adding to the corruption building within his system. The partnership with Henryk continued, and given Henryk's experience as an old hunter, it's likely both men had witnessed the pattern before. Hunters who lasted long enough would see the signs: increased aggression, an eagerness for the kill that went beyond necessity, a fixation that seemed unhealthy. And then, if they lasted even longer, the physical changes would begin. Lengthened canines, excess hair growth, changes in posture and gait. The transformation from hunter to beast wasn't instantaneous but gradual, a slow corruption that stripped away humanity piece by piece. Gascoigne's garb description mentions the beastly stench that eats away at him. This phrasing is notable, suggesting something more active than simply the accumulated smell of killing beasts. The description implies an ongoing corruption, though whether this is metaphorical or literal remains ambiguous. What's certain is that the beast wasn't just something Gascoigne fought in the streets. Based on how bloodlust affects other hunters in Yharnam, the corruption was likely growing within him with each hunt, each blood vial consumed, each moment of violence embraced. At some point, Gascoigne parted ways with the Healing Church's direct service, as indicated by his garb description, which notes he would eventually part ways from the church. The dingy scarf he wore, described as a holy shawl and symbol of the Healing Church, marks this former affiliation. The reasons for this separation aren't specified, and it's unclear whether this affected his hunting. What we do know is that by the time the player encounters him, he's no longer formally part of the church's structure, though he continues to hunt. The young girl's dialogue suggests this wasn't a one-time occurrence, but rather an established pattern. When Gascoigne had been out all night, Viola would use the music box to draw him home, helping him remember his wife and children when he began succumbing to bloodlust. The effectiveness of this method is demonstrated by the fact that the player can use the same music box during their confrontation with Gascoigne to temporarily stun him, triggering some recognition even in his corrupted state. Given Henryk's experience and his tragically long life, as described in his equipment, he would have witnessed this pattern many times before. The old hunter had survived long enough to see countless comrades fall, and the description suggests this longevity was more burden than blessing. As Gascoigne's partner, Henryk would have been in the best position to observe his deterioration, though what he thought or felt about it remains unrecorded. The Scourge's progression. Understanding what was happening to Father Gascoigne requires understanding the nature of the beast scourge itself. The transformation from human to beast wasn't random or arbitrary, but followed a progression that the healing church and its hunters had observed countless times, documented in medical texts, and whispered about in hushed conversations behind closed doors. It began with blood ministration, with that first taste of the old blood that the church distributed so freely throughout Yharnam. The blood healed, certainly, but it also awakened something primal within human flesh, a beast that had perhaps always lurked in humanity's genetic memory, but had remained dormant until activated by this otherworldly substance. The initial stages were subtle enough that most people could rationalize them away or simply fail to notice the changes occurring within themselves. Patients who'd received blood ministration might find their appetites changing, developing cravings they couldn't quite explain. They'd become drawn to the scent of blood in ways that went beyond normal human experience, finding themselves lingering near butcher shops or feeling their mouths water at the sight of fresh wounds. Sleep patterns would shift, with the afflicted finding themselves more alert at night and sluggish during daylight hours, as though their circadian rhythms were being rewritten to match those of nocturnal predators. Physical changes would begin appearing, though gradually enough that they could be mistaken for natural variation or the normal effects of aging and stress. Canine teeth would lengthen slightly, becoming more prominent when smiling or speaking. Fingernails would grow faster and thicker, requiring more frequent trimming and developing a harder, almost claw-like quality. Body hair would increase in density and coverage, particularly on the arms, chest, and back. These changes were rarely dramatic enough to alarm anyone, especially in a city where most people had been exposed to the old blood and were exhibiting similar symptoms. Behavioral shifts accompanied the physical alterations. People would become more aggressive, quicker to anger, less tolerant of perceived slights or challenges. Social inhibitions would weaken, with the afflicted acting on impulses they might previously have suppressed. The capacity for empathy would begin to erode, making it easier to view others as threats or obstacles, rather than fellow human beings deserving of compassion and consideration. These psychological changes often manifested first in how people treated strangers or outsiders, making it easy for Yharnam citizens to dismiss their own behavior as justified wariness in dangerous times. As the corruption deepened, physical changes became more apparent. Arms and legs would lengthen, giving the afflicted an awkward, almost simian appearance. The spine would begin to hunch, forcing the body into a posture more suited to running on all fours than walking upright. The face would elongate, the jaw extending as teeth grew sharper and more numerous. Fur would sprout, first in patches but eventually covering most of the body. Throughout this physical metamorphosis, the mind deteriorated in parallel. Rational thought gave way to instinct. Human emotions were replaced by base drives for food and violence. The final stage saw the complete transformation into what Yharnam called a scourge beast. These creatures retained almost nothing of their former humanity, existing purely as engines of destruction driven by insatiable hunger. They looked like nightmarish wolves or dogs, but with disturbingly human elements that made them even more horrifying. A scourge beast might have hands that were too human-like despite their claws, or eyes that held just enough recognition to suggest the person they'd been still existed somewhere deep inside, trapped and aware, but powerless to stop what they'd become. For hunters, the transformation often manifested differently. Their constant exposure to violence and blood, combined with the enormous quantities of blood vials they consumed to stay alive, seemed to accelerate and intensify the process. Where ordinary citizens might transform into relatively standard scourge beasts, hunters who succumbed to the curse became something worse, They grew larger, more powerful, more savage. Some developed unique characteristics based on their experiences and the specific blood they'd consumed. The beast that emerged from a hunter was always more dangerous than the monsters they'd spent their lives fighting. Gascoigne exhibited all the warning signs. The beastly stench that permeated his clothing marked him as someone far along the path of transformation. His increasing inability to recognize his own wife without the music box's intervention suggested cognitive deterioration. The bloodlust that kept him hunting long past the point of safety indicated the beast's growing influence over his actions. And beneath it all, the physical changes must have been progressing even if they remained hidden under his hunter's garb. The man was being consumed from within, replaced piece by piece by the monster he'd always feared he might become. The music box's power. The tiny music box Viola used to bring her husband home represented more than just a memory trigger. In a city where reality itself seemed malleable, where insight into hidden truths could fundamentally alter perception, and where the line between dream and waking grew increasingly blurred, objects could carry genuine power. The music box wasn't magical in any conventional sense, but its effect on Gascoigne went beyond simple nostalgia or emotional manipulation. When Viola played that melody, it created a moment of clarity, powerful enough to pierce through the bloodlust that otherwise controlled him. The song itself must have held deep significance for both of them. Perhaps it was something Viola had sung during their courtship, or maybe it was connected to some crucial moment in their relationship. It might have been as simple as a lullaby she sang to their daughters, something Gascoigne associated with the home and family he'd built. Whatever its origin, the melody served as an anchor, a connection to his human identity that could pull him back from the edge even when nothing else could reach him. But the music box's power was finite and growing weaker. Each time Viola had to use it, the effect seemed less immediate, less complete. Gascoigne would pause when he heard the music, his body language suggesting internal struggle as the beast within fought against the human memories the melody evoked. The recovery time grew longer, and there would be moments where even the music seemed insufficient, where Viola would have to play it multiple times before recognition finally dawned in her husband's eyes. This deterioration in the music box's effectiveness paralleled Gascoigne's overall decline. The beast was winning, slowly but inexorably, consuming the man he'd been. The music box could still reach him, could still trigger memories of who he used to be, but those memories had to fight through increasingly thick layers of corruption and bloodlust to surface. It was like watching someone drown in slow motion, seeing them grasp for air with decreasing strength until finally they couldn't break the surface anymore. Their younger daughter understood the music box's importance with the clarity that sometimes comes with childhood. She didn't intellectualize its function or question the mechanism by which it worked. She simply knew that the music box could bring Father home, and therefore the music box was precious beyond measure. When Mother went to find Father, she took the music box. When Father came home, the music box had been played. The logical connection was unassailable in her young mind, even if the full implications remained beyond her comprehension. The daughter kept the music box safe when her mother went out on that final night, probably believing that as long as they had it, everything would be okay. Mother would find Father, play the song, and both parents would return home. It had worked every time before. Why should this night be any different? The child's faith in that small wooden box represents one of Bloodborne's most heartbreaking elements, the innocence that exists in ignorance of true horror, the belief that love and memory might be enough to overcome the corruption eating away at everything good in this cursed city. The final night. On the night the player character arrives in Yharnam, the city's hunt has reached a fever pitch. Citizens have barricaded themselves, and the streets are filled with hostile huntsmen. During this chaos, Gascoigne goes out for what will be his final hunt. What exactly transpired isn't fully detailed in the game, but we can piece together the tragedy from what we find. Viola made the decision to go looking for her husband. Whether this was because he'd been gone unusually long or because she sensed something different about this particular night, we can't say for certain. What we do know is that she made a crucial error. She left without the music box. The young girl still has it when the player speaks with her, and she gives it to the player in hopes they might find her mother. This oversight, whether born from haste, worry, or simple forgetfulness, would prove fatal. Viola's body can be found on a rooftop accessible from the Tomb of Eden area, reached by going upstairs past where Gascoigne fights and dropping down onto the roof. She's identifiable by the red jeweled brooch she wore, engraved with her name. The player can retrieve this brooch and return it to the young girl as proof of what happened. In the graveyard below, Father Gascoigne can be found hacking away at corpses with mechanical violence, completely lost to bloodlust. What exactly happened to Viola remains one of the game's deliberate ambiguities. The area contains the corpses of multiple Yharnamite huntsmen, suggesting violence from multiple sources. Did Gascoigne kill his own wife, failing to recognize her without the music box's melody to anchor him? Or did she fall victim to the mob or beasts that prowl these streets, with Gascoigne nearby but too far gone to help her? The evidence could support either interpretation. What's certain is that Viola died. Gascoigne was found near her body in a blood-drunk state, and the music box that might have saved her remained at home with their daughter. The hunter's arrival. When the player character makes their way through central Yharnam sewers and crosses the bridge into the Tomb of Odin, they encounter Father Gascoigne hunched over corpses, his axe rising and falling with rhythmic violence. These aren't beasts he's killing. They're the bodies of Yharnamite huntsmen, the mob members who'd been part of the night's hunt. Gascoigne has turned on his own kind, unable to distinguish friend from foe, seeing only targets for his axe. When he speaks, his voice carries a strange quality. "Beasts all over the shop," he says, using a colloquialism that marks his adopted Yharnam speech patterns despite his foreign origins. "You'll be one of them, sooner or later." Later, he adds, "O lightless creature, embrace thine oblivion, as shall I." This final phrase is particularly striking, as it could be read as acknowledgement of his own doomed state. The delivery of these lines has been noted by many players as sounding oddly tired or disinterested, lacking the fervor you might expect from someone fully consumed by bloodlust. Whether this represents intentional voice direction to suggest some remaining awareness, or is simply the character's particular cadence, it creates an unsettling effect. Gascoigne sounds less like a zealot and more like someone going through motions he can no longer control. The fight that follows serves multiple purposes within Bloodborne's design. On a mechanical level, it teaches players essential skills they'll need to survive. Gascoigne can dodge, parry, and use his trick weapons transformations, modeling the very techniques the player must master. He's aggressive but not overwhelming, deadly but not impossibly so. He represents the game's way of saying, this is what a hunter looks like when they're skilled. Learn from this. But beyond the mechanics, the fight carries thematic weight. You're not battling some mindless beast or alien creature. You're fighting another hunter, someone who once stood where you stand now, who thought they could resist the blood's call. Every blow you exchange with Gascoigne echoes with tragedy because both of you are inevitably on the same path. He's just further along than you are. His transformation into a beast serves as a preview of what awaits every hunter who drinks too deeply from Yharnam's poisoned well. The three phases. Father Gascoigne's battle unfolds across three distinct phases, each representing another layer of his humanity being stripped away. In the first phase, he wields his hunter axe in its shortened form, using it with practiced efficiency while employing his modified pistol to maintain distance and punish aggressive players. His movements are precise, controlled, the actions of an experienced hunter who knows his craft. This is Gascoigne as he was, a skilled warrior who combined aggression with technique, someone who'd survived countless hunts through a combination of skill and experience. But even in this initial phase, signs of his corruption are evident. His attacks carry a savagery that goes beyond professional efficiency. He pursues the player with single-minded determination, his focus absolute in a way that suggests obsession rather than tactical calculation. The way he moves through the graveyard, using tombstones as cover and obstacles without hesitation, shows how thoroughly he's become one with the hunt. This isn't a job for him anymore. It's existence itself, the only thing that matters. If the player brought the tiny music box with them, they can use it during this phase to gain a crucial advantage. When the melody plays, Gascoigne stops attacking, clutching his head as if in pain. For a few precious seconds, the man reasserts himself, memories flooding back in a torrent that temporarily paralyzes him. He's remembering home, remembering Viola and his daughters, remembering what he was before the blood and the hunt consumed everything. The anguish of that remembrance is visible in his body language, the way he staggers as if physically struck. But the effect is temporary. The beast won't relinquish control so easily, and after a few seconds, Gascoigne recovers, the bloodlust reasserting itself. The player can use the music box multiple times during the first phase, but each use seems to work less effectively than the last, the periods of paralysis growing shorter. It's a microcosm of what Viola experienced over the months or years of Gascoigne's decline, watching the tool that once brought him home lose its potency as the beast grew stronger. At roughly 3/4 health remaining, or sometimes triggered by other factors, Gascoigne transforms his axe into its extended form, and the fight's character changes dramatically. The weapon now has significantly greater reach and power, its long handle allowing for sweeping attacks that cover wide arcs. This forces the player to fundamentally adapt their tactics. Where they might have been able to dodge toward Gascoigne in the first phase, closing distance to attack, now they need to respect the extended range of his weapon. The tombstones scattered throughout the graveyard become even more crucial as cover, though Gascoigne proves adept at using them to his own advantage as well. This transformation represents Gascoigne abandoning the last vestiges of restraint. The shortened axe allows for precision and control, enabling measured attacks that balance offense and defense. The extended axe is a weapon of pure destruction, designed to deal maximum damage with minimal concern for finesse or self-preservation. By transforming his weapon, Gascoigne is acknowledging that he's no longer fighting as a disciplined hunter would. He's fighting as something else, something closer to the beast that's taking over his body and mind. His attacks in this second phase carry more weight, both literally and figuratively. Each swing of the extended axe comes with tremendous force behind it, capable of breaking through the player's guard if they try to simply block. The weapon's reach means Gascoigne can punish players who try to maintain distance, catching them with attacks they thought they were safely out of range for. His movement patterns become more aggressive, more unpredictable. Where the first phase might have shown Gascoigne circling, looking for openings, the second phase sees him pressing forward relentlessly, accepting damage if it means landing his own devastating blows. For players learning the fight, this second phase often proves more challenging than the first. It requires understanding spacing in new ways, recognizing the extended reach of the transformed axe, and adjusting dodge timing accordingly. The graveyard's layout becomes even more important, with players needing to use tombstones as obstacles while avoiding getting cornered against walls or terrain. Some players discover that leading Gascoigne up the stairs in the graveyard can create brief moments of advantage, though he remains dangerous even when the terrain isn't in his favor. The music box can still affect him during this phase, though its power continues to wane with each use. The melody triggers the same head-clutching paralysis, the same momentary return of human awareness, but the duration shrinks noticeably. Where the first use might have given players several seconds to land charged attacks, later uses might only provide a second or two of vulnerability. This diminishing effectiveness mirrors the broader narrative of Gascoigne's decline. The human is losing, the beast is winning, and nothing can reverse this trajectory. Players who brought the music box might find themselves rationing its uses, trying to save them for crucial moments, only to discover that saving it for too long means wasting its effectiveness entirely. Some players choose to use the music box aggressively in the first phase, stunning Gascoigne multiple times to deal heavy damage before he can reach the second phase. This approach reflects a kind of mercy, ending the fight quickly, before he has to transform further, before more of his humanity is stripped away. Other players save the music box uses, hoarding them for the later phases, when Gascoigne's increased aggression makes any opening precious. Both approaches work, both reflect different player philosophies about how to handle this tragic fight. If the player uses the music box 3 times during the first 2 phases, something changes. Rather than continuing to stun him, the third use triggers his transformation prematurely, regardless of his remaining health. This mechanic suggests that while the music box can momentarily reach the man within, repeated use actually accelerates his descent into full beasthood. It's as if forcing him to confront his humanity over and over causes something to break inside him, each reminder becoming more painful than the last, until finally, something snaps and the beast seizes complete control. The psychological torture of being repeatedly pulled back to awareness of what he's losing, what he's become, proves too much. The beast, sensing vulnerability or perhaps simply tired of the interruptions, surges forward with enough force to overwhelm whatever remains of Gascoigne's consciousness. Alternatively, if the player simply damages him enough to reduce his health to roughly 50% without using the music box, the transformation occurs naturally. This represents the point where physical trauma and bloodlust combine to push him past the threshold of human endurance. Pain and violence have always been triggers for beast transformation in Yharnam. The body's stress response, combined with the old blood in the system, creates perfect conditions for the beast to emerge. Gascoigne has been holding it back through force of will, but will can only accomplish so much when flesh is failing and blood is flowing. Either way, when the transformation comes, it's horrifying to witness. He throws back his head and howls, a sound that carries both rage and anguish, pain and release, human suffering and bestial triumph all mixed together in a cry that echoes through the graveyard. It's the sound of a man dying, of something dying at least, even if the body continues. His body convulses violently, bones cracking and reshaping, the sound of breaking bone audible even over his screams. Fur erupts from his flesh, silver-gray strands forcing their way through skin in a process that looks excruciating. The man called Father Gascoigne ceases to exist in this moment. Whatever thoughts, memories, feelings, or identity he possessed are subsumed, consumed by the beast that surges to fill the space where his humanity used to be. What remains is a beast, silver-gray fur covering a frame that's grown larger and more powerful, hands tipped with wickedly sharp claws that look capable of tearing through flesh and bone with equal ease, face elongated into something lupine, yet hideously human, in just enough ways to make it worse. The beast emerges. The third phase of the battle strips away any pretense that Gascoigne remains human. The creature that attacks the player now operates purely on instinct and hunger, rather than conscious thought or tactical consideration. Its movements are faster than his human form's movements, more erratic and less predictable. Where the hunter Gascoigne fought with patterns and techniques that could be learned and anticipated, the beast simply attacks according to opportunity and impulse, making it harder to predict its next move. Physically, the transformed Gascoigne is significantly more imposing and dangerous than his human form. His body has grown larger, broader through the shoulders and chest, his limbs lengthened in ways that give him greater reach and striking power. His clothing has torn where his body expanded, revealing thick fur that covers almost all visible skin. The transformation isn't clean or elegant. There are still disturbing human elements mixed with the bestial features, creating something that's neither fully one nor the other, but rather an uncanny hybrid that triggers instinctive revulsion. His hands have become claws, each finger tipped with talons designed for rending and tearing. These aren't crude or makeshift weapons, but rather perfectly adapted instruments of violence, sharp and strong enough to punch through armor and flesh alike. His face has elongated into a muzzle filled with teeth that were never meant for human jaws, multiple rows of sharp fangs designed for biting and holding onto struggling prey. The eyes, which once held recognition and could still be reached by his wife's music box, now show only savage hunger and rage directed at anything that moves. The beast's attack patterns reflect this total loss of humanity and tactical thinking. It lunges with frightening speed, claws extended, aiming to overwhelm through sheer ferocity rather than strategy. It leaps through the air in ways that seem to defy what his bulk should allow, covering distances that would have been impossible for Gascoigne's human form. These aerial attacks come without warning, the beast spotting an opening and simply launching itself toward the player with no telegraphing beyond perhaps a slight crouch before the spring. Every attack carries the full weight of that transformed body behind it, capable of killing the player in just 2 or 3 hits if they fail to dodge or defend properly. The beast isn't trying to wear down its opponent or create openings for finishing blows. It's trying to kill immediately, to tear apart its prey as quickly as possible and move on to the next target. There's no artistry or craft to its violence, just raw aggression and predatory instinct. Interestingly, and tragically, the music box still functions during this phase, though only once. The first time the player uses it after Gascoigne's transformation, the beast pauses. Something happens in that moment. Maybe a flicker of recognition, maybe a last echo of the man who used to exist, maybe just confusion at a familiar sound that the beast can't quite process. Whatever the cause, it stops attacking, seems momentarily uncertain or disoriented, giving the player a brief window to attack or heal or create distance. But that's the last time it works. After that single use, the music box no longer affects the beast at all. The player can play it as many times as they want, but the beast doesn't react, doesn't pause, doesn't show any sign of even hearing it. That fragment of humanity that responded the first time is gone now, burned away completely. The last trace of Father Gascoigne has been expunged, leaving only the monster he became. This single-use mechanic during the beast phase carries profound narrative weight when you consider what it represents. It suggests that even after full transformation, some infinitesimally small piece of the person still exists, buried so deep it can barely respond even to the strongest triggers of their former identity. That first use of the music box is like reaching the very bottom of a deep well, finding one last drop of water that represents all that remains of who Gascoigne was. But that drop evaporates instantly, and after that, the well is truly dry. There's no one left to save at this point, no chance of redemption or restoration. The music box that once brought him home, that represented the love between husband and wife and the bonds of family, now does nothing. Its power is exhausted, its purpose ended. What's left is only violence, only the necessity of putting down a dangerous beast before it can harm anyone else. The graveyard setting adds layers to the tragedy and symbolism of this final phase. Gascoigne is fighting amid tombstones, monuments to the dead that surround him on all sides. These graves represent mortality, loss, the countless dead of Yharnam who succumbed to the Scourge or to the violence it spawned. In his beast form, Gascoigne uses these tombstones as obstacles and cover, positioning himself behind them to limit the player's approach angles or to buy himself seconds to recover from attacks. But he does so without thought or planning, purely through animal instinct. It's the same way a wild creature might use natural terrain to its advantage. not through tactical consideration, but through instinctive understanding of how to use the environment in a fight. He has no idea that he's fighting in a graveyard, no awareness that these stones represent mortality and loss. He doesn't recognize that he's battling among memorials to the dead, doesn't understand that he's become exactly the kind of threat that fills these graves with bodies. He's simply a beast in its territory, defending its hunting ground from an intruder who won't leave. The irony is thick enough to taste. A man who once hunted beasts to protect the innocent has become a beast that must be hunted. A hunter whose profession was ending threats to Yharnam's citizens has become one of those threats. A father and husband whose family relied on him for protection has become the kind of monster they would need protection from. Every aspect of his transformation represents a complete inversion of everything he stood for, everything he tried to be. When the player finally lands the killing blow, the beast that was Father Gascoigne lets out a final howl. Some players report hearing what sounds like words in this death cry, something that resembles, "Forgive me," though others hear only an animal's death rattle. Whether this represents a last spark of Gascoigne's consciousness breaking through, or whether it's simply the wishful interpretation of sounds that have no meaning, remains ambiguous. The game offers no subtitles or confirmation either way, leaving this potential final moment of humanity as one more uncertainty in a story filled with them. Aftermath and consequences. Father Gascoigne's death sends ripples through the lives of everyone connected to him, creating a cascade of tragedy that extends far beyond the graveyard where he fell. His younger daughter, still waiting at home with the music box clutched in her hands, has no idea that both her parents are dead. She sits by her window, peering out into the nightmare streets of central Yharnam, waiting for the return that will never come. When the player returns to her after defeating Gascoigne, they're faced with one of the game's cruelest decisions, though decision might be too generous a word since every option leads to horror. The player can give her the red jeweled brooch that belonged to her mother, the one they retrieved from Viola's corpse on the rooftop. This piece of jewelry, engraved with Viola's name, serves as undeniable proof of what happened. The brooch is described in-game as possibly being a gift from a hunter. Perhaps Gascoigne gave it to Viola early in their relationship, a token of his affection before the hunt consumed him. When the girl receives it, she immediately understands what it means. Her mother is dead. The realization breaks her completely. She begins to cry. Not the loud, hysterical crying of a child throwing a tantrum, but the quiet, devastated sobbing of someone whose world has just collapsed around them. The sound design in this moment is deliberately understated, making it all the more affecting. After receiving the brooch, she'll speak a few words through her tears, and then she's done talking to the player. She retreats into silence and grief, and if you return to her window later, you'll find her unresponsive. She's locked herself in a trauma from which there appears to be no escape, alone in a house that once held her family, waiting for a father who will never return. The game doesn't explicitly show what happens to her after this point, but given what we know of Yharnam and the blood moon that rises later in the game, her fate is almost certainly grim. When the blood moon appears, after the player defeats Rom the vacuous spider and the veil separating reality from nightmare thins, nearly all NPCs who haven't found safe haven either die, go mad, or transform. A small child, alone and traumatized, locked in a house in central Yharnam would stand almost no chance of surviving what follows. Alternatively, the player can tell her about Eden Chapel, describing it as a safe haven where survivors can take refuge from the night's horrors. This option becomes available after the player has visited the chapel and spoken with the chapel dweller, a kind but disfigured man who genuinely wants to help people survive. The girl, trusting in the kindness of the strange hunter who's been trying to help her, decides to make the journey. She's excited about it even, mentioning her father and grandfather, granddad, which has led to speculation about Henryk's relationship to the family, in a way that shows she still has hope despite everything. She leaves her home, ventures out into the dangerous streets of central Yharnam, hoping to reach the chapel and find safety among other survivors. The route requires passing through the sewers, the same fetid tunnels the player navigated earlier in the game. These sewers are filled with threats: infected hounds, hostile huntsmen, crows that attack anything that moves. But the most dangerous resident of the sewers is the man-eater boar, a massive, grotesque creature that the game introduces early as a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Many players, on their first playthrough, choose to simply run past the boar rather than fight it, which makes sense given how dangerous it is. The young girl can't run past it. We don't witness her death directly, but the evidence is clear. After sending her to the chapel and progressing through the game, the player can return to the sewers and kill the man-eater boar. Upon its death, it drops the red messenger ribbon, the white ribbon the girl had been wearing, now completely soaked in blood. The implication is unmistakable. The boar caught her as she tried to navigate the sewers, and she died alone in the dark, so close to potential safety. The cruelty of this outcome is almost unbearable in its specificity. She made it out of her house. She navigated the dangerous streets of central Yharnam. She found the entrance to the path that would lead her to safety. And then, in those tunnels, with the chapel potentially visible in the distance, she encountered something she couldn't run from or hide from, and her journey ended. The player, who thought they were helping by directing her to safety, instead sent her to her death. It's Bloodborne at its most unforgiving, punishing good intentions, and revealing that in Yharnam, there are no safe choices. The third option is to withhold information entirely, neither giving her the brooch nor telling her about potential safe havens. This seems like the kindest option in some ways. Let her keep her hope. Let her believe her mother might still return. Let her wait in ignorance rather than forcing her to confront the truth. But this merely delays the inevitable. She'll stay at her window for a while, occasionally speaking to the player if they visit, still asking about her mother, still maintaining that fragile hope. But as the game progresses and certain events unfold, particularly after the blood moon rises, she disappears. If you return to her window after this point, you'll get the message, "No response," the same message you get from windows where people used to live but don't anymore. Her fate in this scenario remains ambiguous, which in some ways makes it worse. We don't know exactly what happened to her, but given everything we know about Yharnam, about what the blood moon does to people, about how few survive the night, her disappearance almost certainly means she's dead or worse. No matter what the player does, the younger daughter's story ends in tragedy. There is no good option, no choice that leads to her survival or happiness. This is quintessential Bloodborne design philosophy. You cannot save everyone. You cannot make things better. Your choices affect the specific manner of tragedy, but not its inevitability. The girl is doomed from the moment her father transforms and her mother ventures out without the music box. Everything that comes after is just determining the details of how her story ends. But the tragedy doesn't end with the younger daughter. Later in the game, if certain conditions are met, specifically, if the player has given the younger daughter directions to either Aiden Chapel or Iosefka's clinic, and if enough time has passed in the game for her to have attempted the journey, an older sister appears at the same window. This character claims to be Gascoigne's other daughter, the younger girl's sibling, and she asks if the player has seen her sister. There's something immediately wrong about this older sister, something that sets off alarm bells for attentive players. Her dialogue is strange, her tone off, her priorities questionable. She asks about her sister, but doesn't mention their parents at all. She focuses obsessively on the white ribbon that her sister wore, speaking about it with more passion than she shows for her sister's well-being. When the player gives her the red messenger ribbon, proof that her sister is dead, the white ribbon now stained with blood, her reaction is disturbing. She doesn't cry or show grief. Instead, she laughs, a cold sound that lacks any genuine sorrow, and says something about at least having the ribbon to remember her sister by. This is clearly an inappropriate response to learning your sibling has been killed. The implication is either that the older sister has gone completely mad from the blood moon's influence, her sanity shattered by the cosmic revelations and horrors that the moon's rising brought, or possibly that she was never really Gascoigne's daughter at all, but rather some creature or imposter using that identity. The game never clarifies which interpretation is correct, leaving players to draw their own conclusions based on evidence that supports multiple theories. Some players believe she's genuinely the older daughter, but has been driven insane by grief, trauma, and the blood moon's reality-warping influence. Others theorize she might be some kind of creature that's taken the older daughter's place, perhaps having killed or consumed the real daughter and assumed her identity. A third theory suggests she might not be related to the Gascoigne family at all, but is rather an imposter who learned enough about the family to impersonate one of them, possibly seeking the ribbon for unknown reasons. Whatever the truth, the result is the same. The Gascoigne family is ended. Father transformed into a beast and killed. Mother dead in the streets, whether by her husband's hand or by other threats. Younger daughter killed attempting to reach safety. Older daughter either dead, mad, or never existed in the first place. Their home stands empty, their lineage extinguished, their story concluded in the most horrific ways imaginable. The weapons and equipment the player can collect from these encounters serve as grim mementos of this family's destruction. Gascoigne's set, his hunter's garb with its dingy holy shawl and pungent beastly stench, becomes available for purchase after his death, allowing the player to quite literally wear the dead hunter's clothes. His hunter axe and modified pistol can be claimed and used, turned from his signature weapons into tools for the player's own hunt. These items carry descriptions that offer fragments of his story, hints about who he was and what he became, but they can never paint a complete picture of the man behind the equipment. The red jeweled brooch can be used by the player themselves, converted into a blood gem that fortifies weapons and strengthens the rally mechanic, the ability to regain health by immediately counterattacking after taking damage. The description notes it was perhaps a gift from a hunter, suggesting Gascoigne might have given it to Viola at some point, making it a symbol of their relationship. That this symbol of love and connection ends up as a gameplay item, reduced to mere numbers and mechanical benefits, adds another layer to the tragedy. The tiny music box becomes another tool in the player's arsenal, usable against Gascoigne during the boss fight, but ultimately failing to save him. After his death, it serves no purpose beyond being a reminder of what it represented, a family's desperate attempt to save their father and husband from the beast growing inside him. Players might keep it in their inventory long after Gascoigne's death, a memorial to a tragedy they witnessed but couldn't prevent. The Uden tomb key that Gascoigne drops upon death allows progression into Cathedral Ward, literally opening the path forward for the player. But this progression comes at the cost of a family's destruction, the ending of bloodlines, the extinguishing of whatever small lights of hope and normalcy might have existed in Yharnam. The player advances by walking over the graves of those who came before, learning from their failures, absorbing their strength through blood echoes while leaving nothing but tragedy in their wake. This is how progress works in Bloodborne, not through triumph, but through tragedy, not through saving people, but through failing to save them and moving on anyway. The symbolism and themes. Father Gascoigne's story operates on multiple levels within Bloodborne's narrative structure. On the most immediate level, he serves as a skill check, a boss fight designed to ensure players have grasped the game's combat fundamentals before allowing them to progress further. His humanoid form and hunter tactics make him less alien than the cleric beast, easier for players to understand and predict, yet he's aggressive enough to punish mistakes and passive play. The fight teaches parrying, dodging, aggressive counterattacks, and the importance of using the environment to your advantage. But mechanically, Gascoigne also serves as a tutorial for the game's themes. He demonstrates that hunters are not heroes in any traditional sense. They're not immune to the corruption they fight against. The blood that gives them power also dooms them, and the longer they hunt, the closer they come to becoming beasts themselves. By forcing players to kill another hunter early in the game, Bloodborne establishes that this world doesn't work like typical video game narratives. There are no clear good guys, no simple moral binaries. There's only survival, corruption, and the inevitability of transformation. Thematically, Gascoigne embodies the futility of resistance. He tried to maintain his humanity while serving as a hunter. He had a family he loved, a wife who refused to give up on him, children who depended on him. He had the music box, a lifeline that could pull him back from the edge. He had a partner in Henryk, someone who understood the burden of the hunt and could share that weight. Despite all these advantages, despite everything he had to fight for and return to, he still fell. The beast still won. His transformation proves that no amount of love, memory, or determination can ultimately overcome the corruption inherent in the hunter's life. The music box's gradual loss of effectiveness mirrors broader themes about the decay of meaning and connection in Yharnam. At first, the melody serves as a powerful anchor, a link to Gascoigne's humanity that can overcome even advanced bloodlust. But with each use, its power diminishes, until finally, it becomes completely useless. This progression suggests that everything in Yharnam eventually breaks down, that all connections fray and snap, that even the strongest bonds ultimately fail when exposed to the city's corruption. Love isn't enough. Memory isn't enough. Nothing is enough. His final words, that barely audible "forgive me" that may or may not be real, raises questions about consciousness and awareness during transformation. If Gascoigne did speak in that final moment, what was he asking forgiveness for? Killing his wife? Abandoning his daughters? Becoming a monster? Or perhaps he was asking forgiveness for being human in the first place, for having the hubris to believe he could resist the curse that claimed everyone else? The ambiguity of those final words denies players the satisfaction of a clear conclusion, forcing them to sit with uncertainty and doubt. Gascoigne's foreign origins add another dimension to his characterization. He came to Yharnam from outside, drawn like so many others by promises of miracle cures and holy blood. In Lovecraftian tradition, which heavily influences Bloodborne, outsiders often bring fresh perspectives that allow them to see horrors that locals have normalized. But Gascoigne's outsider status didn't protect him. If anything, it made him more vulnerable. He lacked the cultural context to fully understand what he was getting into, arrived without the deep wariness that longtime Yharnamites might have developed toward the healing church's practices. His retention of the Father title takes on added significance when considered through this lens. By keeping his foreign designation, Gascoigne marked himself as separate from Yharnam's established hierarchies. He wasn't trying to fully integrate or become one of them. He remained apart, an outsider who served but never truly belonged. This separation might have been intentional, a way to maintain psychological distance from the corruption around him. Or it might have simply been stubbornness, a refusal to abandon his identity even as Yharnam stripped away everything else that made him who he was. The hunter's reflection. For players, Father Gascoigne serves as a mirror. Every hunter who plays Bloodborne is, in essence, following the same path Gascoigne walked. They arrive in Yharnam from outside, get drawn into blood ministration and the hunt, consume countless blood vials to survive increasingly dangerous encounters, and gradually lose themselves to the violence and bloodshed. The game's mechanics actively encourage the behaviors that led to Gascoigne's downfall. Players are rewarded for aggressive play, for wading into combat and attacking rather than defending. They're incentivized to use blood vials liberally, to never let their health drop too low, to always have more blood in their system. The insight stat, which measures the player's growing awareness of Yharnam's true nature, actively works against the beasthood stat. As players gain insight, their resistance to beasthood increases, suggesting that knowledge and awareness provide some protection against transformation. But insight also makes the player vulnerable to other horrors, increasing their frenzy buildup and revealing enemies and details that were invisible before. The game creates a tension between ignorance that leaves you vulnerable to the beast and knowledge that exposes you to cosmic horrors. Neither path offers safety or salvation. Players who pay attention to their character's appearance might notice subtle changes as they progress through the game. The more beast blood pellets you use, the more you lean into the game's beasthood mechanics, the more your character's eyes begin to glow with that telltale yellow sheen. These are the same eyes that Gascoigne would have had, the same eyes that mark every hunter who's fallen too deeply into the blood. The game is telling players through visual language that they're becoming what Gascoigne became, that the difference between them is only a matter of time and degree. The multiple endings Bloodborne offers could be interpreted as different stages of the player's own transformation. In one ending, the player takes Gehrman's place in the hunter's dream, becoming the next mentor to future hunters, trapped in an endless cycle of violence. In another, they resist Yharnam but are enslaved by the moon presence, forced to serve an incomprehensible cosmic entity. And in the true ending, the player becomes an infant great one, transcending humanity entirely, but losing everything that made them human in the process. None of these endings offer anything resembling victory in a traditional sense. They're all variations on the same theme. The hunter changes, loses themselves, becomes something else. Gascoigne's story, then, is the player's story. His tragedy is their tragedy, just played out earlier in the timeline. When players fight him, they're not just overcoming an obstacle or defeating an enemy. They're confronting their own inevitable fate, looking at what they will become if they continue down this path. The game forces them to kill the person they're destined to be, to put down a future version of themselves, while offering no alternative or escape from that future. The greater narrative. Within Bloodborne's larger story about the healing church, old blood, and cosmic horror, Father Gascoigne represents the human cost of the church's ambitions. Lawrence, the first vicar, founded the healing church with the belief that the old blood could elevate humanity, cure disease, and perhaps even allow transcendence beyond mortal limitations. He saw the blood as a gift, a miracle to be shared with the world. What he created instead was a curse that consumed everyone it touched. Gascoigne and the countless hunters like him were necessary tools in the church's grand experiment. They cleaned up the church's messes, eliminated the beasts created by rampant blood ministration, and maintained the illusion that the situation was under control. But each hunter was also a time bomb, doomed to eventually join the ranks of the beasts they fought. The church needed hunters, but hunters inevitably became beasts, necessitating more hunters, who would in turn become beasts, in an endless cycle that could only end in catastrophe. The Old Hunters DLC expands on this theme by showing the Hunter's Nightmare, a hellish pocket dimension where blood-drunk hunters are condemned to hunt forever, unable to die or escape, locked in eternal violence. Ludwig, the first church hunter, the man who established many of the traditions Gascoigne would have followed, ended up in that nightmare, transformed into a horrific beast-horse hybrid. Even the most legendary and noble hunters couldn't escape the curse. Gascoigne never made it to the hunter's nightmare, but only because the player killed him first. Had he survived, he would have eventually found himself trapped in that endless hunt. Another cautionary tale about the dangers of serving the church's will. The relationship between the healing church and Yharnam's general population mirrors Gascoigne's relationship with his family. The church promised safety and healing, offered blood that could cure any ailment, presented itself as humanity's savior. But that salvation came with a cost that wasn't fully disclosed. The blood that healed also corrupted, and the church's protection came through hunters who were themselves becoming monsters. Viola and her daughters believed that Gascoigne's work as a hunter kept them safe, that his service to the church protected their family. They didn't understand, or couldn't accept, that his role as a hunter guaranteed he would eventually become a threat to them. This deception, whether intentional or simply a consequence of ignorance, permeates every aspect of Yharnam's society. The citizens believe they're being protected when they're actually being used as test subjects. The hunters believe they're serving a noble cause when they're really just feeding their own addictions to blood and violence. The church presents itself as a beacon of hope while secretly conducting experiments that doom everyone involved. Gascoigne's personal tragedy is a microcosm of Yharnam's larger tragedy, one man's fall reflecting an entire civilization's descent into nightmare. The weight of inevitability. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Father Gascoigne's story is its inevitability. From the moment he arrived in Yharnam and partook of blood ministration, his fate was essentially sealed. The music box could delay the transformation. His love for his family could slow it. His partnership with Henryk might have given him extra time, but none of these things could stop it. The beast was always going to win eventually. The corruption inherent in the old blood doesn't allow for happy endings or last-minute redemptions. It just takes and takes until there's nothing left to take. This inevitability extends to everyone in Yharnam. The player character might believe they're different, that they can succeed where others failed, that their choices matter and will lead to better outcomes. But Bloodborne's world doesn't work that way. No matter what the player does, tragedy unfolds. NPCs die or go mad or transform into monsters. The city continues its decay. The blood continues its corruption. The hunt goes on, eternal and unchanging, grinding everyone beneath its wheels. Gascoigne knew this, somewhere deep down. That exhausted quality in his voice when he confronts the player suggests he understood exactly what was happening to him and knew he couldn't stop it. He'd probably watched other hunters fall, seen friends and colleagues succumb to bloodlust and transformation. He'd been partnered with Henryk long enough to witness countless deaths and transformations. He knew where his path led. And still, he continued hunting, because what else was there? What alternative existed in a city where everyone was either a hunter, a beast, or a victim? The game never suggests that Gascoigne was weak or flawed in some way that made him more vulnerable to transformation than others would be. He wasn't a bad person who deserved his fate. He was just a hunter, doing his job, trying to protect his family and serve his adopted city. That ordinariness is the point. If transformation can claim someone like Gascoigne, someone with everything to live for and every reason to resist, then it can claim anyone. No one is special enough or strong enough or good enough to escape. Conclusion. The first true lesson. As players stand over Father Gascoigne's corpse, collecting their blood echoes and the key that will let them progress to Cathedral Ward, they're receiving Bloodborne's first true lesson. This isn't a game about heroes triumphing over evil or good defeating darkness. It's about the futility of resistance, the inevitability of corruption, and the tragedy of individuals caught in systems too large and terrible for any person to overcome. Gascoigne did everything he could. He loved his family, partnered with a reliable hunter, served the church faithfully, and tried to maintain his humanity through it all. None of it mattered. The beast won anyway. The graveyard around his final resting place seems fitting. He fought among tombstones, monuments to the dead, and now he joins them. Viola's body lies on a nearby rooftop, close to the graveyard, her red brooch the only proof she existed. Their daughters will follow soon enough, victims of a city that devours everyone who stays too long within its boundaries. the Gascoigne family's story ends not with a whimper, but with a howl, a beast's death cry that may or may not have contained a plea for forgiveness. For players continuing their journey through Yharnam, Father Gascoigne becomes a ghost that haunts the rest of the experience. Every hunter they meet might be another Gascoigne, teetering on the edge of transformation. Every NPC with a family becomes another potential tragedy waiting to unfold, and the player themselves consuming blood vials by the dozen, wading through beast blood and corpses, growing stronger through violence. They're walking the same path Gascoigne walked. They're becoming what he became, just more slowly, with the difference being that they're the protagonist, and the game needs them functional until the credits roll. The music box remains one of Bloodborne's most haunting items because it represents hope's failure. Viola believed in its power, trusted it completely, and taught her daughters to trust it too. For a while, it worked. It brought Gascoigne home time and again, proved that love and memory could overcome bloodlust. But ultimately, it failed. The beast grew too strong, the corruption too deep. The music box became a symbol of false hope, a cruel reminder that no matter how much you love someone, no matter how desperately you try to save them, some transformations cannot be stopped. Father Gascoigne's story asks uncomfortable questions that Bloodborne never explicitly answers. Is there any point in fighting against corruption when the outcome is inevitable? Does love matter if it can't save the people we care about? What does it mean to be human in a world where humanity itself is a temporary condition destined to end in beasthood or madness? The game forces players to confront these questions through Gascoigne's tragedy, makes them sit with the discomfort of having no good answers, and then asks them to continue anyway, to keep hunting, to keep consuming blood, to keep walking the path that leads nowhere good. In the end, Father Gascoigne matters not because his story is unique, but because it's universal. Every hunter in Yharnam has a similar tale, or will have one eventually. The specifics differ, but the shape remains the same. Human becomes hunter, hunter becomes blood-drunk hunter becomes beast. The cycle continues, generation after generation, with only the names and faces changing. Gascoigne's tragedy is Yharnam's tragedy, is the player's tragedy. They're all the same story, told and retold, echoing through the cursed city's blood-soaked streets, like the melody from a tiny music box that no longer works, but that someone keeps playing anyway, hoping against hope for a response that will never come. The father is dead. The family is destroyed. The hunt continues. Welcome to Yharnam. Welcome to Bloodborne. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Father Gascoigne's tragic story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in Bloodborne's rich lore, from the cosmic horror of the Great Ones to the tragedy of other characters we meet throughout our journey through Yharnam. Let me know in the comments which aspect of Bloodborne's story you'd like to see covered next. Until then, good hunting, and may the good blood guide your way.